So what went wrong? Total lack of direction, many of the leadership asleep at the wheel, but they never seemed to lose their jobs. An engine change partway through the process, attempting to break into a saturated market and not committing to do anything adventurous with the game. When it looked like the game wasn't going to be good on release, David Nicholson even talked about doing a Rainbow Six Siege, like it was almost the plan to release a bad game and fix it after the fact. All internal feedback pointed to it being a bad game, a poor experience, and something ultimately that will melt into the background of an already saturated multiplayer shooter market. Oh, and it was originally going to be a paid-for game, but indeed by the time it was cancelled, they already planned to release it as a free-to-play with microtransactions. Bingo! Here's the story of how you burn $100 million. The scoop, straight from the horse's mouth. The very people that worked on this project all the way through from start to end have multiple whistleblowers, I suppose you can call them that. Mostly they're just pissed off developers that want to see some accountability and honesty. I've done my best to order it all. I likewise have done as much checking and cross-examining as I reasonably can. It all matches up, it all checks out. What you make of it all is up to you. First of all, I'll appeal to this post. This was posted up before I talked to any CA staff about any of this mess. It still only has 400 karma at time of writing. It still hasn't been picked up by any gaming press at all, but it dovetails perfectly with everything I went on to hear later from my own sources, and that you're about to hear. I believe everything in this 400 karma Reddit post is true, and is just the tip of the iceberg, as it says itself. Let's get right into it. So after watching my video, HYENAS is dead. Multiple people claiming to have worked on HYENAS emailed me out of the blue and volunteered some helpful minor clarifications to my video that only someone at CA could know. For the dev that gives an extensive breakdown and that I'll be focusing on, I'll call them Impala. The development process for HYENAS was kinda cursed for various reasons. So, I asked how, get a cup of coffee for this. Impala goes on, to explain what happened with HYENAS, I should probably go back to the beginning. For a long time, CA has been divided into what's called internally the console team and the Total War team. No prizes for guessing what they do. The console team did Spartan Total Warrior and Viking Battle for Asgard. Neither set the world on fire, though Spartan actually reviewed well, Viking less so. Then they made Alien Isolation, which in my view is a fucking good game. However, the development process was cursed, and it took between 6 and 7 years to go from prototype all the way to release. You may be noticing a pattern here. So despite it being a good game, it didn't make a profit as such. I can't remember exactly, but I think it made a small profit on paper, but if SEGA had just put the budget in a savings account for 6 years, they'd have made more in interest or something. This meant SEGA didn't want to make Alien Isolation 2. This was corroborated by another person that worked on HYENAS. Let's call this one of the Cubs. Cub. What smacks of hypocrisy though in all this is that right after Alien Isolation was wrapped up, we had one of our annual cinema town hall meetings where Tim Heaton would come on stage and pitch the next big projects to the company. He said roughly the following: in regards to an Alien Isolation sequel, that isn't going to happen. We've got an exciting opportunity with Microsoft to develop Halo Wars 2. Creative Assembly is a strategy game studio first, and that's what we make. If you don't like it, you can leave. He said that in front of the entire studio. The following week, the majority of the original dev team for Alien Isolation left, citing that speech as a reason why. Big names like lead designer Gary Napper, those who didn't leave were put straight onto Halo Wars 2. That team became isolationists from the main studio of Spire Court. This is the studio Total War's developed in, the main one, and has been for decades. And eternally we all felt as if it were a separate company almost. In that isolation, they experimented with new development techniques and office structure, developing the game in feature release pods and bringing on board more collaborative design workshops. Some of it was good, most of it was dangerously woke, and I feel that leached into the rest of how the company operated over the following years, expanding on things like establishing company ethics and trying to be more inclusive of all races and gender identifications, etc. Back to Impala. The console team needed to find a new project to do, so they did a contract job for Microsoft making Halo Wars 2. That project actually went very well. The game was good and was on time, but people don't really want to play RTS games on a console. The lack of sales didn't affect CA's pay for the job, but it did mean there was to be no Halo Wars 3. So the early planning for that project was binned, and again the team needed a new project. There were a few competing proposals. I don't really remember the others, but one was obviously HYENAS. I think back then it was called Outlaws, but the internal codename was and is Keaton. In the early days, HYENAS aimed for a lovable rogues vibe, surviving in a messed up world controlled by the elite, channel and Han Solo with a bit of Firefly for good measure. It sounded intriguing, but the details were vague. Earth was in ruins, the rich had everything, steel to survive, a gritty sci-fi setting with a touch of NASA. The game was to use the Alien Isolation engine, but the tools were notoriously terrible, so the plan was to have some designers prototype the game in Unreal Engine, while some programmers worked on the AI engine to get it where it needed to be. The rest of the team were shipped off to Total War for a while until there was work for them to do. This is one reason you might see HYENAS devs on LinkedIn with a short stint on Total War. The engine just wasn't going to be ready in time. They went back and forth arguing about this for way too long, just wasting time. Designers wanted Unreal Engine, engineers wanted our own engine. It felt like CA set it up to fail though. There were a lot of programmers sent to work on Total War during this time. Maybe we'd have a fighting chance if they hadn't. Eventually the decision is made that we're switching and everyone has to learn a new engine. In the early days, the game was drawn on looter shooters like Tarkov. The idea of punishing consequences to the metagame had proven itself to be incredibly compelling there. Of course, that got watered down repeatedly because that seemed too hardcore for a wide audience. A point I struggled with given there are incredibly successful AAA games made where the entire point is that they're punishingly difficult. We were updated on the shape of the game, and rather than lovable rogues, they were going with gleeful audacity. They wanted characters who didn't give a fuck, man, and have heaps of tood. They didn't explicitly say this, but you get the idea. The characters looked hilariously bad, unmemorable, unrecognisable, and they even tried to play with some gleeful audacity by making a few test animations of the characters flipping off a security camera or swaggering down a corridor like an idiot. This was a period where it felt like we just had no idea where we were going with the tone, or what needed to be done. Then comes along Neil Blomkamp, a big fan of Alien Isolation. He comes to the studio, and he's shown what we're up to. He has some ideas of a direction to take it in. Basically that you're not stealing to survive, but Netflix, Steam, etc. don't exist anymore. So DVD box sets, music, games, all that physical media is now super valuable. He also had the idea of inserting a lot of internet humour and stuff. He even made a mood video to show what he was thinking, and to be honest, after that period of what the fuck are we doing here, it was a real shot in the arm to have some direction. The project so often felt utterly rudderless. I've actually still got the video. I've thought about leaking it so people can see why some people were attracted to the project. At some point they parted ways with Blomkamp. I hear this was because he thought we should have memes and GIFs and stuff popping up on the UI. I don't know that to be true though. One of the Cubs. I distinctly remember when Blomkamp was brought on board, there was a huge wave of everyone watching The Expanse and how that's what they originally wanted to go after. Blomkamp in his original vision pitch used that as well as the Matt Damon film Elysium. It was Sega's most heavily funded title as it was being backed by some big names in the company, and Neil Blomkamp was even brought in to tighten up the narrative pitch to secure the inline funding. Back to Impala now. As we found out, it's one thing to make a mood video, it's quite another getting internet funny into a game. It just ends up sounding super forced and cynical. Wow, who knew? The game design eventually settled at payday in space, with hero abilities and multiple teams. As you and many others have said, the hero shooter is a super saturated market with other huge players that CA can't take on. They desperately tried to make it seem like it was doing something new and interesting with the multiple teams and NPCs to fight, but it wasn't fooling anyone. It's easy to say this now, but I feel like if they had stuck with something more like the original design, yes, it would have been niche, but it could have worked. Basically a AAA version of Tarkov set in space. It may not have been for everyone, but at least it wouldn't have been boring and bland. Back to one of the Cubs. All internal feedback pointed to it being a bad game, a poor experience, and something ultimately that will melt into the background of an already saturated multiplayer shooter market. Back to Impala. When it looked like the game wasn't going to be good on release, David Nicholson even talked about doing a Rainbow Six Siege, like it was almost the plan to release a bad game and fix it after the fact. Oh, and it was originally going to be a paid-for game, but indeed by the time it was cancelled, they already planned to release it as a free-to-play with microtransactions. Bingo! So what went wrong? Total lack of direction, many of the leadership asleep at the wheel, but they never seemed to lose their jobs. An engine change partway through the process, attempting to break into a saturated market and not committing to do anything adventurous with the game. I'm not angry with SEGA for cancelling, to be honest. I firmly believe it only would have lost more money otherwise. They're typically a light touch publisher, I guess because in the past the studio has been so profitable. I fear those days are now over, but we will see. I'm angry with the shit leadership and for the people above them for not dealing with them. I had hoped that maybe after HYENAS flopped, we could be kept on at CA if the next project was another nice low-risk contract job, like Halo Wars 2, but most of us are likely being made redundant and I'm okay with that really. What I'm actually furious about is that the redundancies are affecting people who had nothing to do with HYENAS, like IT, operations, marketing, HR, and even some people over on Total War. They bear no responsibility for this bin fire. They might struggle more to find the next gig, or maybe they're in a department where they really enjoy their job and they're not going to be breathing a sigh of relief when they leave, like us. It's just all kinds of not fair on them, and it's not good enough. Now over to one of the Cubs. A lot of my friends have left because they were on HYENAS, but others are on the chopping block because CA is basically trying to do a decimation run throughout the company. There's people on brand who only work on Warhammer getting the possible cut, and I'm like, that is bullshit. Don't make people who had no input on the project suffer. Imagine working in that environment and not knowing if you're next. And I have a question I asked at this point. It was further to my observations of an exodus from HYENAS from browsing LinkedIn. It was people fleeing a doomed project. Was there a precipitating event in late 2022? I definitely noticed a spike of people leaving HYENAS and some of them ending up on Total War. Most just left CA though. Impala answers, yeah, exactly. A lot of people left the project because they saw the writing on the wall, or they were just sick of working on it for so long. As you say, a lot just left CA, some ended up in other projects. There's another Unreal Engine project that some wanted to get moved to. They're quite selective though, so they'll absorb a very limited headcount, I think. And another aside, reading your post about Project Keaton made me realise I forgot to mention that HYENAS was Sega's biggest budget game ever, but obviously you heard that already. Towards the end, there were people from Sega Japan more or less permanently at the UK office. This has never happened the whole time I've worked at CA. They occasionally came to visit and check how a game was looking, but as I said previously, generally hands off. Another aside, also the mention of NFTs in that thread, there's huge negativity about cryptocurrencies and NFTs among game developers in general, and CA is no different. I wouldn't expect to see that change anytime soon, but I could be wrong. Maybe they'd try it as an act of desperation. And this was in response to my speculation about the possibility of having HYENAS accommodate NFTs as a way to make it commercially viable, which might have been the plan in the end. I'm just speculating, maybe it can be clarified. But that's all I've got today. It'll be interesting to see to what extent everything I've said gets confirmed and corroborated in the days, weeks, months and years to come. I expect there might even be other ex-CA able to confirm in the comments, and I've got my business email address in the description in case anyone wants to send me anything anonymously, in addition to what I've already had. I've already got plans for similar videos relating to Total War and CA in general, because as you may expect, the rot doesn't begin and end at HYENAS, and I've got more. Subscribe for that, and I'll get around to them soon. Cheers everyone, thanks for watching. If you think what I do has value and you want to support it, then check my Patreon page out. I do my best to give out perks, which include monthly updates on what I've got planned and what I'm thinking about, my scheming. Special thanks to Matteo Olivetti, Nerdington Paints, SJ Mage, Bador Nasser and Desync was here.